Welcome to episode 127. I'm Stuart McCullough, I'm the CEO of VHIA. And starting with this week's Industrial Roundup. For this week's Industrial Roundup, we're meeting with the ANMF commencing on the 7th of October to start discussions for a replacement of the Nurses and Midwives Agreement. Those meetings will occur each Monday and will be the subject of summaries through the VHIA Yammer network. Members will have received a bulletin from us with the Notice of Employee Representational Rights, or NER. Details regarding the distribution of the NER are in the bulletin, and members are asked to advise us when that has occurred, when that task has been completed, as well as the method utilised for distribution. We're meeting with our rural and regional HR and IR managers this week on Wednesday, and we'd like to thank all of our rural and regional members for attending the recent round of rural and regional forums. Over 60% of members attended one of those forums. There's also a meeting this Wednesday for mental health of the MIC. And following on from our report back to the community health members last week with regards to their preferences around the next Nurses and Midwives Agreement, we will continue to engage with that group in terms of the development of bargaining objectives and then a log of claims. As always, all of our activities are summarised through the VHIA community app. That's it for this week's Industrial Roundup. It's now time for the weekly update. Welcome to the weekly update, where we go in depth with a particular subject. And joining me for this week's discussion is the Manager of Workplace Relations Services, Tim Nagle. Welcome, Tim.
Thanks, Stuart. Good to be here.
And that leads us to today's subject for discussion, which is the nurses' EBA, and in particular the ANMF claims which have been submitted in support of the upcoming bargaining process. So in terms of those claims, let's start at the beginning and get down to the basics. When did we receive the ANMF's claims?
So we received the claims on the Friday the 13th of September.
No accident, I'm sure?
No, that's right. I guess the first thing to note though is that we haven't received all of the claims.
So we received we received on the 13th. We issued a bulletin to members on the 16th, bulletin 2487, but you were saying that the claims are not yet complete.
No, so our understanding is that we'll get some further claims, or part 4 of the claims I think it's referred to, in due course.
And what does part 4, what do we expect that to cover?
So our understanding is that part 4 of the claims will include translations and classification translations. So for instance from the level 5 at the NM5 level and above.
So one of the notable things is that we don't actually have a log of claims. We have a track change version of the existing agreement. What challenges arise from not having a log?
Yeah, so it's a bit of a disruption to our normal process. So some of the difficulties associated with not having a traditional log of claims is the consultation process. So how to get feedback from members in relation to each of those claims is more difficult with a tracked document as opposed to a list of claims.
I'm mindful last time I think we had 55 claims to deal with. There were more than 55 changes to the agreement to deal with those claims. In this instance, I think there are some 200 different changes proposed, but it may not be fair to say that there are 200 claims as such. And there's sort of a bit of a challenge just to understand precisely what the claims are.
Yeah, so it's almost like reverse engineering the claims, isn't it? Trying to take what the effect of those changes are and roll them back into what the actual claim is.
So we're due to start our discussions this week on the 7th of October with the ANMF with regards to their claims. And I guess understanding the purpose and effect of those proposed changes is something that we'll be focusing on.
Oh, absolutely. As per the VHIA bargaining framework, we'll be seeking to understand the interest behind the claims in the first instance and then to consult with members about that interest.
So before we start discussing the specific items of claim and the issues that we see and the themes that we see in the ANMF claims so far, I think it's worth just reminding members of a bit of the background for this set of negotiations.
Yeah, so the background is pretty unique in that we don't have to negotiate wages this round. We know that that was part of the 8-year arrangement in 2016 that was sought. So we don't have to deal with wages in this round.
So the second thing though is that there's an obligation on the parties, both ourselves and the ANMF are prohibited from making significant claims for non-wage related items.
Yeah, that's right. So there are rules around the types of claims that the parties can make. So it's worth keeping those rules in mind.
So let's start our examination by looking at one of the key features of the claim, and that's the use of definitions to expand entitlements.
So there are quite a few examples of this, both under the definitions clause at clause 4 and also throughout the documents that has that effect.
Well, let's start with clause 4 in the first instance and beginning at 4J and a proposed definition of the term campus.
So the term campus has not previously been defined in the agreements, not in the existing agreement or the previous agreements. The proposed definition is now up on the screen and states that a campus is as follows: a physically distinct site owned and or occupied by a health service where treatment or care is regularly provided to patients. A single campus hospital provides admitted patient services at one location through combination of overnight stay beds and day stay facilities or day stay facilities only. It goes on to say that a multi-campus hospital typically has 2 or more locations providing admitted patient services where the locations are separated by land other than a public road, not owned, leased or used by that hospital, have the same management at the public health service hospital level and are not private homes. And finally, a discrete place where a health service employs nursing and or midwifery staff to provide coordinated health and nursing services, including an aged care facility. Okay,
so that's around 120 words to define the term campus. And because it's in the definitions section of the agreement, it means that that term has that meaning every time the term campus appears throughout the agreement.
And I think that's a really important point. So the term campus is used over about 100 times throughout the agreement and in all sorts of different contexts. So it's used in the hours of work clause, for instance, the letter of appointments clause, and also various classification descriptors as well.
So when we're considering a definition like that, what kind of things do we need to take into account?
So its impact. For example, even if a definition suits some circumstances, it may disproportionately affect some service models. So it may end up resulting in additional costs or operational impacts.
I think it would be fair to say that the complexity of the definition demands a certain degree of caution.
That's exactly right. So it comes back to the key theme of the log that we submitted to government,
which was that complexity equals cost. So let's move on from there to another proposed definition, the proposed definition of a short shift.
Yeah, so the current definition is as follows. A short shift means a shift of 6 hours duration in addition to a 30-minute meal break.
So there's a proposal to amend that definition.
And the proposal is to amend it to the following. Short shift means a shift of less than the default shift length, but not less than 6 hours duration in addition to a 30-minute meal break.
So there's a term that stands out in that proposed definition, and that term is default shift length. Is that defined in clause 4?
No, it's defined in clause 42.
So how is the term default shift length defined at clause 42?
So clause 42.A is entitled employees or campuses other than the community health centres, not named in clause 42.7.
So clause 42.7 lists by name those employees with an 8-8-10 roster from memory.
It does. So clause 42.8 applies to everyone else except community health centres. And the subclause is just on the screen at the moment. And what that says is that the default shift lengths for all full and part-time employees, not subject to clause 42.7 and 42.9, will be a shift other than a night shift 8 hours, and B for night shift 10 hours.
So before we move on, we'll note that clause 42.8 also proposes default start and finish times, a point-in-time approach with regards to existing practices, and the disputes will be addressed through clause 93.8, which requires a secret ballot of staff.
So, I mean, if we just look at those clauses just as a cluster, there's significant impacts all the way through. In terms of where it leads us, though, it takes us back to clause 4 and that of the proposed definition for short shift, if anything, is anything less than 8 hours. Or in the case of night shift, 10 hours. So those arrangements put together have significant operational impacts across the across health services.
So we need to discuss the proposed definition within Clause 4 of both ward and unit.
Yeah, so the proposed definition of ward is as follows, and that's up on the screen at the moment. A ward includes but is not limited to 1, an operating theatre, or 2, an emergency department, or 3, an inpatient care area comprising a cluster of beds within a single geographic space. A ward or unit shall not exceed 30 beds for general areas, e.g. medical, surgical, aged care, midwifery, day surgery, day procedure, and 10 beds for specialist areas, e.g. ICU, CCU, HDU, without the agreement of the employer and the ANMF.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack in that proposed definition. Firstly, that definition that's proposed is indicative rather than exhaustive. That is, it's not complete. And it includes some areas that may not have been traditionally considered to be wards.
That's correct. And it includes caps for ward sizes, so 30 beds for general areas and 10 beds for specialist areas. We know that's not always the case for existing health services.
And it raises a really interesting question as to the consequence of not meeting those caps. Does that require additional staffing, or does that require capital expenditure?
If it's capital expenditure, it would mean a lot of new hospitals.
So if it's additional staffing, that would obviously be a new cost, but it's not clear at this point what that cost would be. The term unit is also defined.
Yeah, so it is. The term unit is proposed to be defined as follows. A unit is a term synonymous with a ward, but may also include non-inpatient or non-bed-based services that are geographic or clinically separate. For example, X-ray or hospital in the home endoscopy units.
So it's worth considering the proposed definitions for ward or unit in the context of the proposed definition for short shift and the possible risk of restrictions in terms of shift lengths outside of the 24/7 setting.
Yeah, so those restrictions could result in additional costs, but also may raise gender equality issues or equity issues that we'll have to work through carefully.
So those are some of the key definitions proposed in the definition section at section 4 of the agreement. However, there are some additional changes to define terms that also have the effect of expanding some existing entitlements.
So there are. So to give some examples, we've got them on screen now. So clause 29, accident make-up pay. So the definition of regular earnings to include shift loadings, allowances and regular overtime. So that would increase costs. Clause 42, hours of work, defining full-time to mean someone who works 5 days per week, even if less than 38 hours. Clause 48, special rates for Saturdays and Sundays. So that defines the weekend shift as any shift that includes weekend hours, meaning weekend rates start earlier and finish later in the week. So again, another cost item. Clause 50, recall to include those who were on call and have required to remain at work rather than return to work, so it's an additional cost. Clause 56, public holidays, penalty rates to apply to any shift that includes a public holiday, meaning public holiday rates start earlier and finish later. Clause 68, parental leave, removing the definition of eligible employee, meaning there is an entitlement to parental leave in the first 12 months.
So those are some changes that are proposed to definitions to expand entitlements effectively. There are also some proposed changes to the quantum of existing entitlements. What are some examples of those?
Yeah, so we've got a number of examples to bring to people's attentions at the moment. So examples of proposed changes to the quantum of existing entitlements include Clause 56, public holidays, increased public holiday penalties of 250% for weekdays and to 300% for weekends. Clause 57, annual leave, 6 weeks to apply to part-time weekend workers with weekend worker definition including on-call, recall or overtime, and removal of the leave loading cap. Clause 61, personal leave, to include the greater of hours or minutes per year or day, with day defined as the employer's usual shift length. So that will be familiar to people.
That'll be the Mondelez decision.
That would be, yes.
But taken to an extreme.
That's right. Clause 65, compassionate leave, increased to 3 days per occasion or 4 days where death occurs overseas. Clause 68, parental leave, increase of paid leave to 24 weeks for the primary caregiver and 4 weeks for the non-primary caregiver. And finally, clause 70, long service leave, proposed pro rata entitlement at 7 years.
And there's a bit of an NES question there for me with regards to that last item in terms of long service leave. So there are also some new entitlements that are being claimed.
Yeah, so some examples of new entitlements being claimed include the following. So clause 27, superannuation. Proposed changes include contributions during paid and unpaid parental leave. Payment is based on ordinary time earnings plus weekend, shift penalties and regular overtime, and contributions during any period of workers' compensation. So clause 30, allowances. In addition to existing qualification allowance, a new certificate for allowance and a remote allowance as well is being proposed. Clause 33.2, on-call allowance, a special on-call allowance where part of the on-call period includes part of a weekend or public holiday. Clause 35.1, higher duties, a higher duties entitlement for enrolled nurses. Clause 36, a lead apron allowance. Clause 44, breaks, a clothing change break of 10 minutes at the start and end of each shift for those not permitted to wear their clothes uniforms outside the hospital. Clause 61, personal leave, a special carers leave provision for 10 days per annum to care for parents who are elderly, disabled and or sick. Clause 71, blood donors leave, new special disaster leave of up to 3 paid days per year. Clause 72, leave to engage in emergency management activities, for proposal to make unpaid entitlements paid, include paid training time. And finally, clause 73, ceremonial leave, one paid day to attend an ATSI week event.
Okay, so those are some of the new entitlements that are being claimed. I think it's also important to focus on procedural changes because we know that things that affect the operations of hospitals are also a key concern. So what are some of the procedural changes that are being proposed?
Yeah, so there's a number of procedural claims that have been made. So to run through some of those. So clause 11, consultation, proposal to include refurbishment within the meaning of major change and temporary relocation / redeployment within significant effect. So that will broaden out the context where consultation is required. Clause 12, redundancy and associated entitlements to include relocation in circumstances where an employee's role has not been made redundant. Clause 13, dispute resolution procedure, to expand the clause to include any matter or dispute pertaining to the employment relationship.
So broadening the application or the grounds on which a dispute can be notified.
Which is a significant change to the current arrangements. Clause 14, statewide classification committee, proposal to enable SCC to determine a classification, including an existing classification, which is another significant change. Clause 22, letter of appointment / variation, proposal to prevent employees from working somewhere other than their primary site except by agreement. Clause 26, payment of wages, proposal to require that payslips identify the purpose of each deduction. Clause 44, breaks, proposal to require meal breaks to be taken within 4th and 6th hour. Breaks outside this time are paid at time and a half. So that's another significant operational change. So we know that some breaks aren't taken between the 4th and 6th hour of the shift. Clause 45, rosters, inclusion of an on-call in roster 28 days before it comes into operation, with changes of roster if 14 days written notice of a change not given, and 9 hours between successive ordinary shifts instead of 10. 8. Clause 46, supplementary roster and additional shifts. Each employer to work with ANMF to create an electronic supplementary roster. Clause 57, annual leave, additional process requirements for high demand holiday periods. Clause 68, parental leave, a proposed right to extend parental leave for up to a further 12 months.
As opposed to a right to request.
That's correct. Clause 83, registered nurse and midwife definitions, proposed to make CNS classification transferable between hospitals. Clause 86, skill mix, proposal to prescribe skill mix in all acute, general surgical and medical wards. Clause 87, replacement during annual leave and extended leave relief, requirements to replace all nursing hours on extended leave including annual leave.
So I need to emphasise that the changes that the proposed changes that we've identified today are not exhaustive, and that I suspect we'll need to do another podcast solely on classifications once the discussions are underway. So what's the process from this point on?
Yeah, so we'll be meeting with the ANMF to discuss their claims, each of their claims on commencing Monday the 7th of October.
And each Monday thereafter?
Yep.
And as per the bargaining framework, we'll be seeking to identify the interest behind each of those claims, and that will be the basis that we then consult with members, because every member who's watching this at the moment will have a lot of thoughts that they want to share and a lot of feedback that they want to give. So our challenge will be to create a process once we get the interest to facilitate that feedback.
And we'll also be undertaking a risk assessment so that we can stratify the risks across the log of claims.
That's right, and in terms of those risks, we'll be identifying high risks where they have a high risk of financial impact or an operational impact. We'll do that in consultation with members, but the high risk items will then become the basis of our communication strategy, particularly with CEOs.
Correct.
Tim, thank you so much for taking us through the ANMF claims with respect to the upcoming negotiations for nurses and midwives.
Thank you, Stuart.